Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second lecture in Chapter 16. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the Maya city-states and pretty much go through an in-depth explanation of their society and what they did. All right, so let's get started. So, to understand the Maya, you need to understand the geographic kind of location they're in. And the area that they were located in is primarily what we would call the Yucatan Peninsula. And you can see it there in the bottom picture of the screen, and it's stretched south um, just a little bit more from what you can see in the picture. And really, we're looking at much of southern Mexico and northern Central America um, in today's world. Now, in the northern part of the Mayan lands, you had rainforests and dry scrub, whereas in the south, it was more highlands. It was cooler, you had mountains, and a little bit more of a diverse geographic kind of setup. And the Maya culture, as well as many of the other cultures at this time in Central America, were built on the and focused on influences from the Olmecs who were before them. All right, so next we're going to talk about the urban centers of the Mayan culture, and you can see in the map kind of the area of influence for the Maya um, at its greatest extent, and their history is spread into different periods, very similar to um, that of ancient Egypt. And from 250 to 900 AD or CE, it's what is known as the Classic Period. And this is where you saw their spectacular cities of the Maya rise and really have their greatest power and influence. And that was Tikal, Copan, Chichen Itza. Those were kind of the three big ones, Uxmal and Palenque as well. Palenque a little bit later. But each of these states are very similar to what happened in ancient Greece in the Maya culture. In ancient Greece, you had city states. In Maya, you did as well. And each was ruled by a god king, a king that viewed that they were a god or at least linked to their religious um, leaders or religious gods. And these cities were the centers for not only religion because of the god kings, but also of trade. And you'd have at various times you'd have these bigger cities like Tikal or Chichen Itza exact influence over other cities as well. And kind of the featured structures within these cities were pyramids as well as temples, as well as elaborate carvings due to their writing system all over the cities, and even the ball courts, which we'll take a look at that ball game here in the next section when we talk about the Aztecs. Right here, this is I can't remember. I'm blanking on it right now. I believe this is Chichen Itza. You can actually go down there today in Mexico and visit this site, and you can just see that is a very extensive in, city and ruins that are left. And we know just based on looking at what they've been able to do before you even start actually examining it, we know the Maya were a very, very skilled set of builders in advanced society. All right, so let's talk about the agriculture and trade of the Maya. And the city states were linked across this region and across this culture by two things, by trade and by alliances. And what did they trade? They traded a lot of different goods because they had a lot of different things to use. I mean, look at in terms of just the geographical differences between the North and the South, and the fact that they're sitting on the Gulf of Mexico and so forth. So these people, so they traded salt, they traded shells, honey, jade, cotton, even as a textile. Their currency was actually the cacao bean. That is what we use for chocolate. They actually had it in such abundance, they actually used it as their actual form of money. The typical diet of the Maya was maize, beans, squash, as well as some meats and fish. And how did they farm? Well, they did it primarily in two ways. They used slash and burn tactics, which actually can be really good, but they can actually deplete the soil very fast. And in some ways, over time, some historians and anthropologists and archaeologists believe that they actually fell because of this, is one of the reasons why they actually fell apart or declined. And then they also used raised beds and terraces to grow food as well. And we'll talk more about these raised beds and terraces in the form of what the Aztecs used. So I won't really touch on this too much here. But we'll talk more about that specifically when we get to the Aztecs. All right, here, guys, this is just a map. Shows you the area of Maya influence. There again, very similar to the map you saw in the previous slides right here. But this one's a little bit more extensive because you can actually see the typical, or the most important um, trade goods, where they were located, and then also you can see the trading routes, or at least in where they go in terms of down south, possibly even into northern South America, and then obviously up more into um, northern Central America, or what we call Mexico today. All right, so the society of the Maya is pretty pretty standard for a lot of the Central American and as well as Native American cultures. Um, Again, farming and trade were bringing in huge amounts of wealth for the Maya city states and people within them during the classical period. And their social classes develop over time. And typically, you actually had the upper classes were the nobles, so you had the priests and the warriors. This also included the king, who was at the very top, or and then you had the middle class, which were merchants and artisans, and then at the very bottom you had the peasants. And remember, the king is not just at the top of the society as a political figure; they're also the religious figure as well, and this is a hereditary position. Here you guys can actually see the pyramid structure, class structure for that of the Maya. I take a second and view this just for pause this video and take a second to look at this. All right, next we're going to talk about the religion of the Maya. And the Maya were polytheistic. They believed in both good and evil, or both in certain circumstances and in certain festivals and gods. They also had close association with the directions and colors. So you can see there the north was associated with white, south yellow, east red, west black, and the center was green. And this all tied together within their religious and worshiping systems. And they actually would worship gods by giving them gifts, whether it was in flowers, food, but they would also even practice blood sacrifice as well. Now, in terms of them practicing blood sacrifice, they could use animals from time to time, but obviously their most famous one in terms of the historical record is going to be their use of human sacrifice. And what they would do is oftentimes they would put their victims in a hole or a cenote, and then put things of value like gold and jade and other offerings in the hole with them. And it was all based on trying to please the gods and offer a balance out for the world. And it was to kind of protect their societies from evil, bring good luck, and so forth with these ceremonies. All right, next we're going to talk about math and astronomy for the Maya, which is perhaps their greatest accomplishment as a culture. So when you look at the Maya religion as well as their reliance on agriculture, the Maya had to develop not only important systems centered around looking to the sky in terms of astronomy, but also they had to develop very accurate calendars as well, or at least some kind of accurate system to be able to tell time. And they were so successful that their calendars were basically as accurate as what we have today. And they actually had two calendars. They had a 260-day calendar and a 365-day calendar. They had days that were set out that could be lucky or unlucky for a certain god or gods, and you had to know that depending on what was going on at the time. And basically what they did is they were able to develop techniques to gain an understanding based on the positioning of the sun and the moon and the planets, that they could understand where things were and what day it was, or where they were in their calendar. Now, their math system was really important as well. They actually had a math system that was sophisticated enough that it actually included a zero, which is important because at this time in Europe, European societies actually didn't have the zero. They did have a 20-based math system, had a 10-based one, but it was still a highly accurate math system. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the written language. The written language of the Maya was the most complex and developed in the Americas in the period before the arrival of Europeans. And this is something that's actually very similar to the hieroglyphic writing system that we see in Egypt. Obviously, the glyphs are going to look different, they mean different things, but it's fairly similar to that of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. They had about 800 glyphs or symbolic figures that would allow them to write. And they could mean a whole word or just a few syllables. And oftentimes we have records of a lot of this writing. It took a long time for us to gain an understanding of it, but we have a lot of records of the Maya writing system in what are called codices. And the most famous writing for them, and we will actually read this in class, a portion of it, is the Papal, which recounts this creation story for the Maya culture and the Maya people. All right, so now we're going to talk about the decline. Their decline is actually quite mysterious. We see various stages in their history, like the classical period or the post-classical period, where you start to see cities that actually get abandoned, or things shift, trade routes shift, or power shifts to maybe the north or shifts to the south. But we also know that other groups started to settle in their lands, such as the Toltecs, which leads to a change in culture, that leads to increase in warfare, trade gets disrupted. We possibly have over farming because of the slash and burn techniques, and obviously because of greater population growth, which leads to shortages and famine, and people move. But ultimately, all this stuff over a period of several hundred years leads the Maya to be very weak and divided by the time the Spaniards arrive in the late 14 and early 1500s. All right, guys, and that's all I have for you here on the Maya. We'll talk a little bit more about them and some other things a little bit later, but I'll see you guys in the next one when we talk about the Aztecs.